As we begin today's program, we want to acknowledge that this virtual showcase is replacing our biggest fundraiser of the year and raises critical funds for MCA and all of the work we do. We'd like to take a moment to recognize our generous sponsors that have made these events possible. Thank you to all of our donors and sponsors. Making the connection is just one element of Voices Driving Change and MCEA's work. Please learn more about our upcoming events, read the stories of Voices Driving Change in our magazine, and support our work at voicesdrivingchange.org. Plan to join us for Legally Green on September 24th. This capstone event is our annual fundraiser and unlike any other virtual event. Beautifully staged with fresh and dynamic content, this 35-minute program will leave you energized and inspired. After the event, you'll have the opportunity to hear some untold stories and ask questions of our team. Register today at voicesdrivingchange.org. If this is your first time joining us, thank you for being here. The Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy uses law and science to protect Minnesota's environment, its natural resources, and the health of its people. Thanks to the investment of people like you, MCEA has been on the forefront of Minnesota's environmental movement for almost 50 years. MCEA works in the courts, at the legislature, and with public agencies to create, strengthen, and enforce smart environmental laws. All of the work of MCEA is made possible by the generous support of our donors. Please join us in fighting for a healthy and sustainable future by texting Drive Change to 844-949-3684 or visit voicesdrivingchange.org. Your support will make more possible.
With me today is Kathryn Hoffman, CEO of MCEA, and Beth Zemsky, an intercultural organizational development consultant who's been working with MCEA. And I'm Andrew Steiner, MCEA board member. So Beth, let's start with you. What is racial justice? What is racial justice, and what injustices are happening today?
Thank you, Andrew. First of all, I just want to say how thrilled I am to be here and how much I value my partnership with MCA over the last year or so, and getting to know Kathryn and the amazing staff of the organization and the important work that you do. So let me just start at the beginning. I want to start with differentiating a couple of words that we use a lot: diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice. So one of the things that we've been talking about a lot in the environmental movement are the differentiations between those things. And the easiest way to understand it is we can think of diversity as numerical representation. Count the people. Who's at the table? What is that representation? What voices are there? We can think of inclusion as essentially, do the people count? Do we have policies? Do we have structures? Do we have an organizational culture, or in a sense, even the movement of the environmental movement for the voices of those who are most impacted by environmental injustice to count and be represented in a way that makes a difference in terms of policy? And then equity is really, does the outcomes count? Are we really targeting some of the environmental work we're trying to do towards those who are most impacted by environmental degradation, whether that's in the urban environment, the rural environment in which MCA works, and around the state and around the region, and what are the long-term consequences of outcomes to various communities? So given all that, then how do we think really about justice? So we can really define racial justice is when people have the same rights and opportunities afforded to them by society institutions within a society. And that could mean safety, housing, food, education, water, to support a basic quality of life and survival. I think it's important to think about equity as a condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicted how other norms would work in reinforcing sort of racial group identity, the way in which we can think of some races, in this case, white folks, as being more valued by our institutions and our structures than other folks who in this case are Black, Indigenous, or people of color who live in communities where we have more environmental degradation. Justice, on the other hand, which I just want to put out as a definition, is not just the ending of the practices that might marginalize folks. It's also the proactive reinforcement of policies and practices, attitudes, actions that produce equitable outcomes over the long term. So we can think of equity as ameliorating negative impacts and justice as how do we think forward strategically about how we might work to make sure the things that are currently happening in communities no longer happen. And we see injustices right now around a broad range of issues. Most visibly here in the Twin Cities, it's been the treatment of Black people by police, the murder of George Floyd, and around the country, the murders of Breonna Taylor, the shooting of Jacob Blake, and unfortunately too many other folks than we can even fit in a 30-minute webinar today. So these shootings have brought attention to long-standing issues about racism, race and racial injustice that is structural within our society and within the Twin Cities and within Minnesota. So we're going to talk more about what does that have to do with the environment today. But as a nation at this moment, these incidences have really ignited conversation about historical racism in a way that is just a very exciting moment. And I think it's a very exciting moment where there's some real opportunities to speed up some of the changes many of us have cared about for a long time.
Thank you. Kathryn, let's connect this to the environment. If we care both about the environment and racial justice, how are they connected?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And I'm really excited to be here today with you and Beth to have this conversation. MCEA's mission in protecting the environment is really about our most basic quality of life and our survival as a species. We really can't obtain a quality of life without clean air, without clean water, without a stable climate. Our world today, both internationally and within the United States and in Minnesota, we've created a system where the environment, the air, the water, does not support some communities as well as others. And many of those communities that aren't well supported, that have more pollution, are communities of color, they're indigenous communities, and our environmental laws have not been applied in a way to protect all those communities equally. Some have become basically sacrifice zones, where society has said, you know, we're going to accept more pollution over here than over here, based on not much more than the color of the skin of the folks who live there. And there's a lot of science to back this up. You know, Yale did a study that found that whites have the lowest exposure for some dangerous pollutants. They looked at 14 different pollutants and found that whites have the lowest exposure, whereas Hispanics are much higher, as well as African Americans. The National Resources Defense Fund, NRDC, also did a study around toxic waste sites. They looked at Superfund sites and places where toxic waste is stored, and found that more than half of the people who live within less than 2 miles of toxic waste facilities are people of color. And you can name other issues too, lead poisoning, for example. You know, there was this high-profile incident that happened in Flint, Michigan a few years ago, which is a community that is predominantly Black. Those are high-profile examples, but we see it as a trend, and that's what science shows. So the issue of race and environmental safety and protection are intimately connected.
Thank you, Kathryn. Beth, you know, looking for our audience, looking at the three of us on screen, they may be wondering, you know, what is it for the three white folks on this panel to be talking about racial justice and having this conversation?
Thank you, Andrew. You know, I love this question because at first glance, it might think, what are the three of them doing talking about race? And I want to go back to something that we talk about, we say a lot, particularly in the field when we're talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity, which is, it is dominant culture, white people's responsibility to dismantle racism because the system of racism serves us. I really resonate with the term sacrifice zones, right? Because what does it mean for us to have the certain amount of privilege not to see the sacrifice going on and literally to dump our waste on other people? And if that system, as Kathryn said, means that as a white person, I am less exposed to environmental toxin, then it's my responsibility to do a couple of things. First of all, to see the things that I typically don't see, that I have the privilege of not seeing. Then to feel the impact of what does it mean for those communities? What does it mean for my humanity that there are these sacrifice zones that allow me not to be able to be in a place where I have to deal with these on a day-to-day basis, that I've shuffled them off to somebody else. And I have to say, part of that feeling is, how does what's happening violate our deepest held values? And that's on us. That's on us to see and feel that dissonance. And then it's on us to act. Because one of the things that sometimes happens is, as white dominant culture folks, we expect those who have most impact to educate us. So not only are they experiencing the degradation of their environment and dealing with the day-to-day stress of it, but now they also take the energy not just to deal with all of that, but to teach us to see, feel, and act. And I think it's our responsibility to hone the skill to see, to really open our hearts so that we cannot live if the environment for some people violates our deepest held values, and then to gain the skills to act. And thankfully, we have MCEA and other actors in our community who can help us figure out, how do we act most effectively? And so I really do think it's on us as white people to educate ourselves and to gain those skills, and not to put an additional burden on those who are most impacted.
Thank you. I think that's a good opportunity to connect to MCEA and our role. Kathryn, could you speak as to why racial justice matters for our goals at MCEA?
Yeah, so justice is one of MCEA's core values and has been really since our founding. Lawyers, of course, by our nature, we hold justice close to our hearts. It's really important. We think about access to the judicial system. We think about, a jury of your peers. There's lots of ways that justice is an important part of the legal system, and that lawyers value justice, although, of course, we know the legal system is not always effective at representing those values. But we can't have racial justice without environmental justice. So if you think of a facility like a mine that threatens Lake Superior or the boundary waters, a lot of us think of that as a threat to our core values, the way that Beth put it. It's a threat to our health, to our well-being, and to the places that we love. In the same way, pollution that threatens communities across the state harms all of us and offends our basic value of justice when those communities are threatened. It's also not a city problem or a rural problem. I really want to dispel that notion. It's really, environmental justice as an issue is statewide. So we do see communities of color in Minneapolis and St. Paul who are more likely to have polluting facilities built in their neighborhoods, for example, maybe because of zoning laws or just because there are already facilities there and it's easier. Lots of historic reasons why that happens. But also rural communities across the state are seeing problems. For example, there's increased nitrate pollution in the drinking water in rural communities across the state of Minnesota. It comes from agricultural runoff. It's really a looming public health crisis that's not getting the kind of attention that it should, and it's very costly because folks in these rural communities have no choice but to either drink the polluted water or pay for expensive treatment system, because this tends to be in private wells. Another example is indigenous communities. The tribes across the state are concerned about the loss of wild rice beds, mercury contamination in fish, which is especially high in, for example, the St. Louis River, crude oil pipeline proposals like Line 3 near their homes. So we see these effects of environmental justice as a statewide problem, not just a city problem.
Beth, you've been observing MCEA as a partner in recent years. What do you have to add to this point?
Yeah, so I think the examples that Kathryn brought up are super important. And I just want to add a couple of additional thoughts about how racial justice really matters for MCEA's goals for the environment. And one of the concepts we've been talking about in our work together is this concept of universal design. It's actually a concept from the disability rights movement. The most classic example of it is the curb cut in the sidewalk, who is designed for those folks who had least access, who are most impacted by our built environment. And so it was built for those who are most marginalized, who have the most impairments, and everybody uses it. So one of the concepts we've been thinking about at MCEA is how do we identify those who are currently most marginalized by the way in the environment is set up, the way environment disparities are set up. How would I identify who's most marginalized, put them at the center of the planning, and then test how it impacts everybody else? So it sort of turns the sort of planning process on its head. Rather than thinking about what is the majority of people, how do we think of those who are most impacted and hold them at the center of the planning? So one of the ways, just to sort of think about a link to this, to what Kathryn was saying, is that there's nitrate pollution in drinking water from agricultural runoff. And the cost for that is being borne by those communities who have least resources to deal with it. So in some ways, it's a transfer cost. So if we actually had the cost of nitrates in agriculture borne by the farmers, then borne by the food system and all the food we actually eat, we would all be experiencing the cost of the environmental degradation that's due to agriculture runoff. Instead, we've made a transfer cost, which contributes to the sacrifice zones that Kathryn was talking about. So really holding those communities at the center can lead us to a much more systemic understanding of what's happening in the environmental system and where the cost should really be borne. This is just another reason why us as white folks should be talking about it. So one of the things we say in sort of organizing right now is we want all lives to matter. We want all communities to experience good drinking water, clean air, healthy environment, but all lives can't matter unless Black lives matter. And all lives can't matter unless those tribes and indigenous communities who are experiencing the cost of essentially the transfer cost of environmental degradation are put at the center of our planning. So I just think this is an important piece. If we really want all lives to matter, we have to have those lives matter where we're dumping all our stuff. And we have to take responsibility for dumping our stuff in that way. So I think it's really central to MCEA's goals to sort of think about this and shift that, and to think about where are the costs being borne and how to shift the system so the costs are actually borne where they're created.
Thank you. So Beth, clearly we need to make change. How do we make change? And very relevant today, what is the role of protest in making change?
Yeah, so Kathryn knows I love this question because I'm somewhat of a wonk about social movement theory. So one of the things I want to say, Andrew, is that the thing about movements is they move. That's why they're movements. And there's different ways that movements move. We often think about movements in terms of protests, what's happening on the street. So what's happening on the street is super important because it's a way to create energy. And then the activists on the street forms networks, and the activists on the street sort of test out different narratives. But change and protest is not just street activism. What's important in movements is that there are different actors doing different things all at the same time. And I'll just give an example from my own history working in the HIV movement. So partly, around the time of HIV, there was also this lack of government response and systems that really said our lives didn't matter, and ACT UP took to the streets. But in addition to that, there were scientists in the AIDS treatment groups, and there were lawyers working with the FDA, the CDC, and the government around what laws were going to protect people and maximize the community's health. So if we think about that as an example, and there are many other movements that are like that. We think about the civil rights movement. We had folks on the street, but we had lawyers, most well-known Thurgood Marshall, who were deeply taking the energy from the streets and then thinking about what are the specific policies and laws we need to change in order to take that energy to work with activists, to have deep partnerships in community, to move the systems to actually make the change that folks on the street are asking for. And so I think as we think about MCEA's role, it's not like racial justice just means protest on the street. It also means those connections and those partnerships to move things in systemic ways. Because if racism is systemic and institutional, then we need folks to be able to work with those, to move those institutions to counteract the impacts of racism. And I think MCEA is uniquely suited to do that.
Kathryn, do you have anything to add?
Well, I love Beth's examples of the importance of lawyers and movements. I could not agree more. And, I think of, for example, our partnership with a community group in North Minneapolis, which is a neighborhood that is an industrial sacrifice zone, has a lot of facilities, and the environmental laws have not been applied in a way that protects this community. And we have data to show it. So the Pollution Control Agency has been collecting air pollution data in this neighborhood and find that there are high levels of some very dangerous pollutants. And there's also high levels of asthma in this community. And so there are community partners demonstrate, and they show up at city council meetings and state agency meetings, so they have their public face of the movement. And meanwhile, MCEA can support that, for example, by providing the legal tools to try to move some of these facilities either to close or bring them into compliance with environmental laws. And so it's a really, there's a place for all of these different kinds of expertise and work within the movement. And the lawyers and scientists play a really critical role, and MCEA is proud to partner with communities to help them in their goals of seeking environmental justice.
A follow-up, Kathryn, about MCEA. You must have people who come to you and say, what does racial justice have to do with MCEA, and ask whether it's mission creep and just one more thing for us to work on.
Yeah, I do have people that ask that, Andrew. Many folks define environmental justice very broadly, which I think is fair, because there's housing issues, access to education, police brutality. There's a lot of things that have contributed to communities facing more barriers and getting less institutional support than others. And if you look at environmental justice broadly, it encompasses all of those issues. So people say, well, how can we be sure that MCEA is going to stay focused on its strategic niche as an environmental law and science organization? And there's a couple things I want to say about that. The first is that we work within an ecosystem of groups that are seeking environmental justice. A lot of different kinds of organizations with different skill sets. And increasingly, we're working with some groups that are not our traditional environmental partners. They're new partners for MCEA. So we are broadening our scope. We're broadening our ecosystem in a very real way, but our expertise is the same. We bring our expertise in science and law to bear. These are tools that are desperately needed in this fight, and they're tools that we've been using for decades. Minnesota is blessed with some strong environmental laws, and I say blessed, but I'll just pause for a minute because, of course, MCEA is a 47-year-old organization, and our founders helped write a lot of the great laws we have today. So MCEA played a role there, and they can be used strategically by communities, and MCEA can help with that. So environmental review, we have a great environmental review law in Minnesota that says we have to study projects and determine their environmental impact and act to lessen that before we can start to build facilities. We have the Minnesota Environmental Rights Act, which actually allows anybody to sue polluters for causing pollution, impairment, or destruction. And these are tools that are very familiar to MCEA. We can also work to bring about new rules and new laws. That's part of our skill set as well. And all of these can be very powerful to protect communities. So lawyers and scientists are the key part of any fight. This isn't new to our mission. In fact, it's really at the very heart of it. So that's the first thing. The second thing I want to say is that MCEA's work with Beth in particular has been really helpful for us to achieve our mission. So Andrew knows that in 2017, the board tasked MCEA with doing more work with communities to make sure that we're engaging in outreach and partnership as much as possible. And that meant doing two things. One is making our own organizational culture more welcoming and inclusive. So the idea here is to make sure that MCEA is a place that's welcoming for all employees, both to achieve goals around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and just because it's the right thing to do as an employer. The second goal is to improve our intercultural communication skills. And what we're trying to achieve here is to help MCEA work with people from a broad range of backgrounds. So intercultural communication skills, that's a skill set that allows people to be able to walk into conversations with lots of different people and to adapt, to listen to others, to understand them, to express ourselves in a way that is most effective in that setting. And this has been really good training for us as lawyers in particular, because we're sort of used to walking in the room and being the heavy. You know, we're the expert. People listen to us. They want to know what we think. That's the way that lawyers show up. And frankly, that's the way our training has taught us. So it's really important that we also hone our listening skills, as well as learning to be effective communicators in any setting. So I would say, in addition to MCEA occupying a very clear niche within the environmental justice movement, we've also just gotten better at working with people from different backgrounds in a way that is, been a little bit of a challenge sometimes to our lawyers, but they're absolutely up to it. And it's made us much more adaptive and effective communicators and better partners.
I might add to this conversation, I've been on the board now for about 8 years, and during that time, MCEA has certainly grown and developed significantly. And I would say my own perspective on our mission and what we can do to change outcomes in our state has also grown and developed. Looking back when I joined MCEA, it was really a personal focus on outcomes for the environment, clean water, clean air, mitigating climate change. And for me, it was really in my little bubble around me. It was about me, it was about my family. But over the past few years, I've also broadened my perspective. I've learned about how these environmental outcomes affect different groups of people in our state, really in very different ways. One of the first examples for me was learning about how air pollution along the I-94 corridor between Minneapolis and St. Paul disproportionately affects Black and Brown communities. And so the part of the mission covering the health of its people in our mission statement has really become job number one for me as well. So understanding the quality of the environment is directly tied to the health of all people in Minnesota, and not just their physical health, but their mental health. It has really become a priority for me and for the organization. And I think is really front and center for how MCEA makes priorities around our legal and our policy efforts. So with that, we finished our questions for today. I'd like to thank you, Kathryn, and thank you, Beth, for sharing with us your perspectives and your expertise. And now to our audience, thank you again for joining us today. I've had a wonderful and educational time, and I hope you did as well. Please consider making a gift to support MCEA's great work. As a reminder, MCEA is a nonprofit 501c3, and your gift helps MCEA staff protect the Minnesota we love for future generations. Again, visit voicesdrivingchange.org or text Drive Change, that's one word, Drive Change, to 844-949-3684. I hope you continue to enjoy the events in our showcase and see you at our capstone event, Legally Green, on September 24th. You don't want to miss it. We will feature more of the voices that are driving change, including young environmental activists, an international human rights advocate, and a wildlife biologist, as well as a chance to interact with MCEA staff. Register today for this free event at voicesdrivingchange.org. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you to both of you and to all the
Thank
great
you.
work MCEA is doing.